Good afternoon, everyone. Today is January 11th, 2022. We are here for Maryland Public Service Commission PC54, the Montgomery County Community Choice Pilot Program Working Group Meeting. My name is Jennifer Grace. I'm the Public Utility Law Judge assigned to this matter. First, as a matter of business, our working group is meeting every other Tuesday at 1 o'clock. Unfortunately, we're somehow got on a schedule where we're meeting at the same time as another work group. So we're going to have to push our next meeting by 1 week. So our next meeting will be Tuesday, February 1st at 1 o'clock. Let's see. Looks like on the call today, we have Adam Fairbanks, Al Bartlett, Antonio Saruco, Ashish Mehta, Beverly Sikora, Bob Reaping, Dan Tudor, Daria Pugh, David Bloom, David Hoppick, David Warmer, Drew McAuliffe, Elizabeth Stroud, Jennifer Tucker Barthol, Kenneth Albert, Cassia Dana, Katie Lanzarato, Christina Montgomery, Lori McGilvray, Leah Gibbons, Lily Hawkins, Lisa Brennan, Lynn Fieri, Melanie Grant, Misty Rininger, Peter Wilson, Philip Vanderhayden, Robbie Atkins, Robert Brown, Robert Laub, Stan Edwards, Taylor Beckham, Tiffany Cowan, and Valerie Mayoni. So staff circulated a document with some points on the next issue that we're taking up. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over at this point to staff.
Thank you, Judge Grace. Everybody, this is Phil Vanderhayden for the technical staff. Hopefully everybody has a copy of the issues list that we sent around. So today we want to talk specifically about the billing procedures. I think we've kind of reached some general ideas about how this is going to work, and we want to make sure we kind of go over that with everyone. Staff was able to meet with the PHI company last week, and so I think we've had the opportunity to get some feedback from them, but certainly interested in hearing any more that PHI may have regarding the issues. And then we did not have the chance to talk with the other utilities. So we hope that what we've learned from PEPCO will be consistent with PE and BG&E, but we certainly want to hear about all that as we go through. So we're going to talk. So for the next couple of meetings, we're going to talk about billing and enrollment. We are attempting to leave enrollment for the next meeting and the meeting after that, and that's because we haven't had the chance to sort of sit down and go through all those details. So really today we're just trying to go through issues related to billing, and I think the takeaway that we have from our discussions internally and from the discussions we have with PHI is that the existing utility enrollment system, or the utility billing system that is used for utility consolidated billing under retail supply will work for the CCA. It will work for the scale of the 200,000 some accounts that we expect to see. And aside from costs associated with kind of the handling of transactions and the volume that we're dealing with, we are not expecting to see significant system or programming costs due to changes required by using the CCA. And so that's, I think, a good takeaway. It really helps to kind of put that aside as an issue for things we have to start planning for. And so I want to kind of make sure everybody else comes away from that, or if we've missed anything, that we try to pick up on that during our discussion. What you've got there on the billing issues, there's about 6 or 8 kind of bullet points that we want to go over and talk about as the sort of in support of that general overall concept that we've got, that this is going to work, more or less using the existing retail choice market functioning without a lot of changes. there are some conditions that the CCA sort of has to adhere to in order to make that work. And that kind of the primary one there is that that second bullet that says the CCA will use a Maryland licensed retail supplier or retail choice service provider. When we say familiar with the Maryland electric choice market, that sort of means able to transact using the existing sets of rules. I think we kind of touch on some of the details later on, but what this really means is if you're not using a retail supplier, if the CCA does not choose to use a retail supplier, but I think that was our initial simplifying assumption, but I think in response to what we had heard from Montgomery County's folks is that there's a desire to retain the option of using or developing your own portfolio without going directly, through a retail supplier, that it would be necessary to be able to transact. Retail suppliers have to do a number of things, including issues related to their participation in PJM and some of the financial responsibilities they have there, in addition to what they need to do with the utility to sort of test their ability to transact and make sure that they can meet all of the requirements in terms of the times and the windows for transaction processing and that sort of thing. So that second bullet's got a lot of stuff wrapped up into it. I think what we're operating with is that there's nothing about the way we expect the CCA to operate that would not permit that. And so before I go on, I just maybe we have the Montgomery County folks on, I think. Can I ask them to maybe give us an initial, do you to the extent you've been able to take a look at this outline since last week and maybe have some discussions with your consulting folks, are you seeing anything right off the top that would lead you to believe that this is not correct?
When you say not correct, Phil, are you talking about the second bullet or in general the whole document?
The second bullet in particular. I mean, to the extent we get through some of the other things, we'll probably need to explain some more of the things. But we're running with this assumption, having spoken with PEPCO. I guess what we really need to make sure is that to the extent your folks are sort of exploring how CCAs have operated in some of the other jurisdictions, and with your knowledge of what goes on in Maryland with retail supply, does this sort of gel with what you're thinking as well?
I think the way you described it, it does. Essentially, you're saying that whatever we come up with has to look and act like a Maryland licensed retail supplier and operate in the same way as a Maryland licensed retail supplier. Yes,
and in particular under the utility consolidated billing approach, where the utility will essentially send you information about each customer's bill each month, and you will send back to them, in this case, the amount that you'll need to collect from that customer. And then essentially the utility will receive the money from the customer, having billed the customer, and then will remit that to the CCA in a manner that's consistent with the way retail supply for, I think, most accounts works now. Most everyone's probably on UCB for the residential accounts in particular.
Yes, I think that's consistent with what we've been thinking.
Okay, sounds good. So I think we're sort of comfortable with the idea that the technical problems for this are minimal, and maybe have to do with just sort of scheduling a volume that's bigger than what has happened in retail choice. Going a little bit further, now these are some policy elements here. So looking at the third bullet,
I'm sorry, Phil, this is Leah. Do you mind if, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I couldn't get myself off mute before you moved on. I was wondering if I could ask a quick question.
Yeah, please.
And I don't know if Stan's the right person or somebody from the county, but I guess I'm just curious and have a question about regarding that second bullet that you all were just talking about a moment ago. I mean, it does occur to me that at least for the work group meetings we've had thus far, we haven't been able yet to have an opportunity to kind of lay out what those different models look like and actually talk about what retail suppliers do in the market. And I don't, you know, I know the county's been working really hard to get their arms around, you know, how all this stuff works. And we had that separate briefing on SOS a few weeks ago or before the holidays. And I just wanted to throw out there, you know, the supplier community is really interested in having that conversation. Now we would love to be able to sort of lay those kind of issues out for everyone, and particularly for the county, just to kind of help give you a better sense of sort of what we're talking about and the scope and breadth of all the things that are out there that we work on. So just kind of putting a pin in that. I know you want to get on through this agenda, which is fine. I just kind of wanted to throw that out and offer that as something that I think would be really useful to the group and hopefully, you know, prove very useful for the county as well.
Yeah, we would welcome that.
That'd be great. Great. All right. So maybe I can follow up on email and sort of make a couple of suggestions and proposals for how we could put something together. That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Leo. All right. So moving on to the third bullet there. So there's cost recovery issues that we currently have a system in place to recover the items that are sort of listed below in the bullets under the discount rate components. But there's probably more than one way to do this. But a discount approach under the purchase of receivables for retail choice, what happens is there is essentially a portion of the billed commodity that is kept by the utility as compensation for expenses associated with providing that billing service. So it is it might be I think they don't get much larger than 2%, and sometimes they're 0, sometimes they're 1%. But the way the POR discount rate works, if you bill $100, you're going to get paid like say $98.50 for those revenues, and the utility retains the $1.50 or the amount reflected by that. And that is one way to do it. SOS does not function in that way. In SOS, there is an administrative charge that recovers many of the same things, not exactly the same things, but many of the same things, in particular the uncollected costs. And that is a fixed amount that is charged on a per kilowatt hour basis. But it is not a percentage of the bill. Those two methods kind of evolved from different approaches, but I think we are, just for simplicity, looking at, let's just treat this like retail choice because it's going to use that system, and then use the POR discount rate approach. All right, so that's kind of that's why we've sort of gone with this as the assumption, but we do acknowledge that we understand SOS has got a different way to do it. There's probably pros and cons that I know that we haven't spent a lot of time trying to figure out at the moment. All right, so let me just spend a little bit of time talking about how POR sort of calculates the discount rate, because that's the amount that usually has a lot of interest to the retail suppliers, and the CCA would also need to understand if they're billing a particular rate to recover their commodity costs. They will need to adjust their rates they're charging in order to be able to recover the costs that are going to show up that the utility needs to recover from them, and in the manner by which that's done to this discount rate. So, and I think we sent links around after the last meeting that had the supplier consolidated, or the supplier coordination tariffs rather. Those particular, I know BG&E's has these items laid out in the tariff, sort of described perhaps in a little more detail. So you can kind of look at that to see where some of the things are coming from. But the discount rate is essentially devised by taking the annual amount of expected sales and then taking the amount of the annual expenses you're trying to recover for the bullet items that are down below the discount rate. I think you can barely see it. They're the square. Judge Grace, if we could roll down so that the purchase of receivable up, yeah, so they can see a couple of the square bullets there. So the way the discount rate works is it's just a percentage that the numerator is the total amount of expenses. The denominator is the total expected revenues over which those expenses get collected. That gets filed by each utility every year. We would probably have to do something like that. And I think we will probably talk a little bit further down in the bullet list as to, will the POR rate be different for the CCA? Will it be separately calculated? Be calculated using the same mechanism and the same components, that sort of thing. But just the way it works for retail choice, it's the total expenses that you need for a year to recover. It's a little bit projected and a little bit based on historical. And then there's typically, I think it's a projection of the expected revenue, total sales in dollars. And then you divide that and you get a percentage, and then you apply that to each bill. And there's true ups that occur, and there's some carrying costs and that other types of things that compensate and utility for carrying it. But essentially, it's adjusted annually. It's typically telegraphed to the retail suppliers pretty far in advance, and it tends to be reset coincident with the June bills that go out, so that it lines up with changes to the SOS market. At least that's how it's like ideally would work. Sometimes that doesn't happen on time, and things have gotten moved throughout the year. But that's probably the optimal time to make that change. We would probably do something similar for the CCA in order to keep it, on the same cycle. All right, questions on the POR rate mechanism, how that works, and I'll go into the components in a second if there's no question. All right, so we listed the 4 or 5 types of costs here. There is also an offset, which we'll talk about. I know there's some controversy associated with that, so no one's making any judgments or decisions here. I'm just telling you how this works for retail choice.
Hey, Phil,
Yes.
there are some hands raised. I'm going to start with Al Bartlett.
Okay.
No, sorry, Judge Grace, that symbol came up when I was connecting my headset because I was having trouble hearing Mr. Vanderheyden.
No worries. Lisa Brennan.
Good afternoon. Phil, I don't think we got copies of the links that you were talking about sending around. So could you resend those and be sure to include the email address that I gave for Michael Krauthammer, who's going to be joining us?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, I think can I do that after the call?
Sure. Yeah. I just want to make sure that he's on the latest distribution list going forward. He's on the call today.
Okay.
He's on the distribution list, and I'll go ahead and send that out now. Lori McGilvray.
Thank you, Judge Grace. Phil, I would appreciate, as being someone who's less familiar with how purchases of receivables works, if you could just back up slightly and walk us through what components or what elements constitute the purchase of receivable, what is included. I realize it would be the generation, but then you've talked about this discount rate, and I'm curious if there are other things that comprise the POR.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm about to go into the components that are added to the amount recovered from the discount rate, but I think maybe I'll back up a little bit. So make sure everybody understands, when a retail supplier is on consolidated billing with the utility, and right now that's the only way to do it unless you each send a separate bill. The utility sends a separate bill, the supplier sends a separate bill. That's not used a lot. I think it's used probably for some commercial accounts. But what this means is, people, there's an assumption out there that's probably correct, that people really only want one bill from the utility each month, or just one bill, whether or not it comes from the utility. So that they're not getting a separate bill for commodity and generation and commodity and energy are really the same thing. It's the cost of creating electricity from a generator somewhere out on the system, and the transmission and distribution are separate functions. Distribution, the utility's job is getting it to you, to your house, to your apartment. Transmission is getting it from wherever the generator is physically located to a connection to the distribution system. So the generation and the transmission tend to be grouped together as a charge. Although for utilities, it's still a regulated charge and it goes connected to SOS. And the distribution rate, everybody pays no matter where your source of energy comes from, but it is always billed by the utility, and the utility charges it, and that's how they recover their costs of providing service. So with consolidated billing, the utility is essentially doing what it normally does, which reads the meter and they issue the bill, but only for their distribution piece. What they do is they take that meter reading data, which let's say it's 1,000 kilowatt hours in the monthly read, and they transmit that to a retail supplier, to your retail supplier, the one that you have selected and is currently assigned as your supplier. The retail supplier, now this is done in batch process, thousands of units at a time, thousands of bills at a time. The retail supplier gets that information and then calculates what you owe them based on the rate that you've contracted for, which could either be a fixed rate, per kilowatt hour that stays fixed the whole contract, or it might be a rate that changes every month, or it might be some other thing. But without talking about other stuff other than energy, which they calculate your bill. So if it's 1,000 kilowatt hours and it's like a 6-cent rate, 6 cents times 1,000, you get a $60 bill. And they say they take that $60 and they put it back into a transaction. Think of it as a complicated email with 1,000 other things in it, and they send that back to the utility, and the utility goes, all right, you need $60 from the customer, presuming that this retail supplier gets it to the utility in time, which most of the time usually happens, but occasionally doesn't. And then there's something else you got to fix, but we're not going to worry about that at the moment. The utility says, all right, $60 is what you owe supplier A. I put that on your bill. You owe us $45 plus, $10 monthly charge. They add all those things together and you pay your bill, and you pay the utility. Utility says, all right, I got $60 from the customer to pay so they paid in full, so no complications with non-payment or not full payment. They get $60 from the customer, and they say, all right, well, we have a 1% discount rate. So you billed $60, but 1% of that is 60 cents. So I'm going to subtract 60 cents and keep that, and I'm going to send back to you $59.40. So that's how the utility collects the costs that they have on their system to render a bill on behalf of the retail supplier. And then the retail supplier, they billed $60 based on a 6-cent rate. And these rates are not representative of current rates, by the way. I just kind of pulled that number out of the hat. I should have used 10 cents, but that seems high to me. The retail supplier sets their rate knowing that they're going to lose some small percentage of that each month to cover expenses. So, Lori, does that clear up what the discount rate's doing and how the money gets transmitted back and forth?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. But I guess the other piece I'm wondering, are there other things built into this? For example, you've talked about administrative fees, and there must be some way that a retail supplier actually makes money. And I don't know if that's built into the rate or if there is some embedded administrative fee, their transaction costs.
Okay, so everything that the retail supplier incurs as a cost to generate your electricity or buy it from someone else, and then they have that, that's their commodity cost, just the raw supply piece of it. They also have the cost to market to you, to maintain customer service people, all of the administrative overheads that any business has to deal with customers, they've got. The utility never sees it. In fact, no one ever sees it except the folks inside the retail supplier. So the CCA, for example, if the CCA has costs and overheads associated with managing accounts, acquiring, procuring the supply, aside from the actual raw supply cost, the CCA will have to figure all those things out, bundle it together, and come up with a rate that will recover everything they need to recover. But the utility doesn't have a particular dog in that fight. They don't they don't know, and they really have no concern about it. What they're concerned is, we sent you the right kilowatt hours, you sent us back a dollar amount to put on the bill, and then you put it on the bill. Now, there are other things that happen, on both ends, but essentially the two things are distinct. They really don't see, the supplier doesn't see the inside of the utility's operation, the utility doesn't see the inside of the supplier, nor the CCA's operation. And then the CCA, or the retail supplier, is essentially free to put whatever into their rate they need to recover. Now, the CCA has, I haven't read through the oversight requirements that the commission has for the CCA's rates recently. So there is a little bit more, like the CCA has a little bit of oversight on it. But I mean, typically you have to recover these costs, and the only way to do it is to charge the customer for the most part, because you don't have anybody else to charge. I'm not sure I answered your question. That's what I thought you were asking about.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
And Phil, this is Robbie real fast, just to put it out there that we only purchase commodity. We will not purchase non-commodity charges.
Yes, Robbie, that's correct. I have that as a bullet point on the second page, probably the fourth one from the bottom of the second page. So we'll probably need to go over a little bit of detail as to how the utility will sort of detect that, and like what happens if someone does that. So I will definitely want to touch upon that
Okay.
later.
Thank you. Got it.
Okay, was that all the questions, Judge Grace? Did I get everybody?
Yes, you've covered everybody.
Okay. All right. So moving down, so we've got the little circle empty bullet there for discount rate components. We've got 5 listed here. I think that generally covers everything that we deal with. So programming, system costs, admin costs. These can be, I've sort of lumped these all together, but so programming and system costs, I think we've sort of figured out that we don't have to build any new systems for this or make significant modifications in order to handle this. So that should be relatively small. There are administrative costs that sometimes the utility will incur. I expect that if there are separate and distinct CCA admin charges or costs that the utility has, there will be a tariff rate or a filing of some kind that will allow folks to examine that and make sure that it'll go in front of the commission ultimately. If the commission will hear as to whether or not it's acceptable, and then they'll accept something. But just building the systems that can allow the transactions to occur with the level of performance expected, those are programming and system costs. Administrative costs, there might be ongoing expenses. People have to sort of maintain and monitor the system, check for errors and that sort of thing. So the utilities, they have that sort of thing that they get to recover through this. Costs that are sort of identified or allocated or assigned to retail choice make up these costs for the POR rate, and I expect we would follow the same approach for CCA costs. All right, second square bullet there, uncollected revenue. So there's some accounting that goes on with like the terms here, but think of uncollected revenue in its final sense as someone has been billed for something and they didn't pay the first month and they got assigned a late fee, and then they didn't pay the second month and they got a late fee, and then at some point in there they have a delinquency notice and then maybe a termination notice, and then they ultimately are disconnected for non-payment and do not reconnect. So all of those bills that got added together, that started the delinquency, and all of any late fees and charges that got added to that bill, as that happened, those become written off after the customer disconnects. And I think there's a period of time after which, like, they have to be disconnected for a while with the assumption that they didn't come back to the system, having made up the amount that they owed. If that's written off, it's assumed to be gone and not recoverable. And sometimes that comes back, and there's ways the utilities adjust for that thing. But for the most part, if it's uncollected, it's not something that is uncollected yet and will be collected. It's something that is written off and you're not going to collect it. So it's actually a relatively small portion. It might be on the order of like 1 or 2% of billed revenue is written off, depending on service territories and that sort of thing. But it adds up, and it's something that when it needs to be recovered by the utility. And so if it can't be recovered from the customer who didn't pay the bill, the utility isn't asked to sort of eat that cost. They are permitted to recover that from everyone else. So uncollected costs are mixed in to the expenses the utility incurs, and they are allocated to the customer classes. And I guess they typically apply it as a just an amount of revenue that gets recovered based on kilowatt hour sales of some kind. So for regular distribution, uncollected costs, those are kept separately accounted for. The utility puts those into their expenses in a rate case and recovers it that way. For retail choice uncollected costs, those are accounted for the utility consolidated billing revenues, and those get sort of stacked up over time. There's an estimate of how much can get collected over the next year, which, I mean, you try to collect it all, but there's variations in sales that change that. So the annual amount of uncollected revenue is probably somewhere around 2% of the billed revenue, and they can sort of make estimates to that, and that is the amount that's that's collected from. So uncollected revenue related to utility consolidated billing is collected solely from retail choice customers. Now, we understand that customers can move back and forth between SOS and retail choice. They can also move out of the service territory and that sort of thing, but that it's done on an average basis to the existing base of customers, and that's a simple way to do it, and that's how it's been done, and it, for the most part, works pretty well from a reasonableness standpoint. So presumably uncollected costs for the CCA will be identified, and we have to decide sort of policy-wise if that will be kept distinct from the rest of retail choice customers, distinct from SOS customers, or is there going to be some mixing and allocations in there? That there are some things that might need to happen at that point. But generally speaking, when the CCA starts off, there might be a way to figure out and project what uncollected revenue might be and start with that, or there might be some previously uncollected costs associated with standard offer service or the accounts that were part of that maybe you start off with a balance. That uncollected revenue is money that the utility has no other source to fund, and so it's collected from the existing rate base of customers. All right, and feel free to jump in. Judge Grace, please advise me. I can't see all of the hands that pop up, but and of course, folks can probably just chime in if they have a question. I do see Beverly Sikora with a question from BT.
Yeah, there's some hands raised. Bev Sikora.
Hey, I guess it's not so much a question, but a bit ago now, you made a comment about, not having significant additional costs or having to make, changes. And I think that's probably true when it comes to kind of just the strict billing aspect of things. But, I do think there could be some complicated system changes with, if it turns out that, well, I mean, when we have to make Montgomery County be the default provider for their, customers, I think that could be pretty complicated to fix in our, or to change in our system. So I just want to make sure people, realize that, it might not be as bad as it could be, but there still could be some decent costs that have to get incurred to make some somewhat substantial changes.
Thanks, Bev. That's a good point. I was sort of lumping that into the enrollment sort of discussion that we haven't had a chance to drill into. I think what we want strictly isolating how billing's going to work.
Okay.
We asked PEPDA. We didn't talk to your folks, so if your folks have some other concerns about that, do want to know. But
yeah, no, I think, if you're just looking kind of strictly at the once the customer's enrolled and, you're just doing the straight up billing, yeah, I think you're right. It's not going to be, I think getting to that point that could be complicated.
Yeah, we were definitely gonna, and in fact, we may appreciate having the extra week between this meeting and the next to spend time talking to all the utilities about their concerns about how the billing is gonna, how the enrollment rather is gonna work. So definitely a good point. We will be sort of examining how to make this all happen. If it turns out that there are enrollment costs, maybe that is something that ends up being incorporated in a recovery mechanism that uses the billing process. But for the purpose of we wanted to get a low-hanging fruit one on the billing and say, looks like this is going to work without too much trouble, but we're just trying to make sure that's a correct assumption. So,
Okay, no, that's cool. Just wanted to make sure it was on people's radars.
yep.
Phil, it looks like you also have a question or comment from Stan Edwards.
Okay.
Phil, is the uncollected revenue portion of the discount rate the same for all retail suppliers, or does it vary by retail supplier?
So I think generally the way the POR rate is calculated, all uncollected costs are lumped together. In other words, retail suppliers, I don't think they have individual discount rates. I think it is a rate that is, I think it's possible to do that because I think I've seen some discussion of sort of tracking that individually, but I think the general practice is that the uncollected costs are for all retail suppliers are lumped together. Now, all retail electric choice customers are lumped together for the purpose of calculating this, or the ones that were historically in effect during the previous 12 months. That's sort of how they do it, with possibly some projecting forward of costs if that's possible. But there is not I don't know if was your question, do the individual retail suppliers have their own POR rates? And I think the answer is no. I think it's one rate for everybody.
Thank you.
Well, aren't there different rates by classes, maybe?
Yes, there are. There are definitely rates
Okay.
by classes. So your residential rate, small commercial rate, and the extent you've got type 2 customers, they have a rate. But each retail supplier pays the rate for the customer that they're serving in that class for that account.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, we get everybody?
Now, one more, Lori McGilvray.
Yep. Okay.
Sorry, it took me a moment to unmute. So Phil, thank you, and Judge Joyce, thank you for recognizing me. Phil, thank you for noting or asking the question whether the utilities can identify the kind of uncollected revenue piece, because it looks like you're suggesting that that's retrospective uncollected revenue that gets paid by future discount rate billing mechanism. And so there may be some rollover into the CCA where uncollected revenue that the utilities have get basically applied or charged to the CCA. So I'm curious if it's possible to identify the portion of accounts that for which there are uncollected revenue that are attributed only to Montgomery County, and that the CCA not somehow bear uncollected revenue requirements for other parts of the utility territory.
Okay, so it's a great point. I think we do need to figure this one out because there's something in the law that talks a little bit about this as well. So just to sort of step back a little bit, this problem, if this is a problem or just a condition, the way you collect revenue is just generally with utility stuff is there's a historical cost that gets incurred, and then you use future sales to recover it. Sometimes you have projections in there that allow you to sort of project forward costs if those are going to be very different. But on October 1 of 24, there will be an uncollected SOS balance that PEPCO has not yet collected. and BG&E and PE for the customers in their entire SOS service area. And then we're going to, on that date, remove, in the case of Pepco, roughly half of the accounts from which the sales would have recovered the costs that were previously incurred by the entire amount. So when it's sitting there kind of going, wait a minute. So although Montgomery County, through the CCA, those customers, they presumably will have some amount of uncollected costs as well. They will not be available to fund the recovery of the balances that they had incurred previously. I think everybody gets that, but I just wanted to make sure. I think, Lori, that's what you're sort of addressing. Kind of.
So I think maybe the issue is larger for the other utilities, that somehow the CCA would be bearing the uncollected revenue of the entire BG&E area, where only 14,000 customers are in Montgomery County. So there's just kind of an equity issue there, I think, how this is done.
No, it's generally just, it's done on a percentage basis. So, we'll look at our experience overall, but it's not like you'll pay Montgomery County would pay its proportion based on its, the billings to those people. It's not like we're going to try and put costs from other jurisdictions into Montgomery County. It's, if we determine that overall, it's a 1% discount rate, say that 1% is only applied to, the billings that we do on behalf of, the customers of the CCA. If that helped any.
Yeah, I still think there's something here about rolling them forward into the CCA, but I don't want to take time here, and I'm still on the learning curve. So maybe we can dive more deeply into this in a future conversation.
Lord, it is an issue we need to sort of make some decisions about how this happens. I think what we're taking from today's discussion is there's not a technical problem in doing this. There might be some things that have to happen that aren't being done right now, but we will need to decide how to manage existing SOS balances of uncollected costs, because those were, under the existing system, those get recovered from all Pepco's customers that are on SOS. And if half of those customers are no longer taking SOS service, and like the previous 12 months worth of SOS uncollected costs are now going to be collected solely from the remaining SOS customers, the majority of whom are living in Prince George's County and not CCA eligible, then that's an adjustment that needs to be made. Going forward, we may find that there is a difference in the uncollected rate in Montgomery County than there was from the rest of the service territory combined, that I think we would most likely take the uncollected experience or the uncollected expense that's happening in Montgomery County, because it would get identified by the POR uncollected costs as they're accounted for, and then that would be correctly applied to Montgomery County solely going forward. And I think what Bev just said is that there's the proportion of your uncollected cost that it's being picked up is going to scale with the number of accounts or the amount of sales per account. So it's typically not like an absolute calculation. It's like if you use more electricity, it's almost well, for SOS, it's actually, there is a rate. It's roughly $4 on 1,000 kilowatt hours. That is the admin charge rate, of which 2 of those dollars reflect the estimate of what uncollected costs are, and I think that gets adjusted a little bit here and there. But so it's probably everything that the way utilities collect costs tends to be allocated in some way, and usually that allocation is examined and approved by the commission before it's put into effect. So, well, there's a lot of like sort of cash flow things that are happening here that I think would benefit from maybe some sort of like a graphical description of where the money's going, and we can try and do that. I don't think we need to make any decisions precisely until we have a little bit of time to kind of work out some of those details. But so if it doesn't make a lot of sense right now, I completely understand, because there's definitely way more moving parts than just a single firm would deal with. All right, Judge Grace, any further hands up?
No, go ahead and go forward, and I'll share screen again.
Okay. All right. So right up below uncollected revenue is the late fee revenue offset, and I know this is a controversial topic, and there are a lot of policy issues. I just sort of want to, if you go and look at the supplier coordination tariff, you will probably see this late fee revenue offset. So I wanted to talk about it. If we're modeling, what we're doing here on retail choice, we'll have to sort of calculate these. So the late fee revenue is collected every time. So the Maryland late fees for bills, they max out at 5% of the total billed amount, and they get incurred at the first month, I think, is 1.5. The second month is 1.5. If you are not yet terminated and incur a third month of uncollected charges, I think you're looking at 3% for the total of 5. So 1.5, or no, sorry, 2% for the last month. 1.5, 1.5, 2%. So these are fees that they have a number of reasons why this has to get collected. A lot of it has to do with the cost the utility incurs to actually recover unpaid amounts. There potentially is a sort of this working capital that gets larger when people don't pay on time, that this sort of can help to recover. But it was noted at one point during the development of the POR system for retail choice that late fee revenues get incurred as a result of the bills that go out and are recovering retail choice revenue. At the time, there was not late fees were not being applied to that portion, and then when those began to be applied, that was an additional source of funds. And so to the extent that credit and collections expense was incurred and charged to the discount rate, and uncollected revenue was incurred and charged to the discount rate, the late fee revenue is also available there, but not as an additional charge, but something that is charged to customers that pay late, but ultimately then pay their bills. And so that is used to reduce the expense associated and make the discount rate less than it would have been. And so that is something that exists in there. I do understand this is controversial. This was controversial when it was established, and we will need to examine whether or not this policy is appropriate for use the way the CCA is built, given some things that may be different. But it is an element of the discount rate for retail choice, so that's why it's in there. All right, so the next two are similar but distinct in how they are sort of created. I'll talk about carrying costs first. When the utility incurs costs associated with POR, and when there were so you incur uncollected costs throughout the course of a year, and they go sort of up or down, as things become uncollected, or if customers are terminated and you establish those. There's definitely a lag because it takes a while for a billed amount after termination to be sort of determined to be no longer collectible, and it sort of goes into that account. So it's a little bit of a lag. There are programming costs that you amortize. Now, I think we've said we don't have any of those, but just as an example, if it costs $500,000 to build a system and you're trying to collect that over 5 years because it's $100,000 a year, there's like the utility spent $500,000. They're only getting back $100,000 every year, so they have some carrying. That money is sitting out there that they had to pay out, and so they get recovery for it. So those are carrying costs, and they reflect balances that sort of vary over a period of time, based on the fact that the late fee revenues for some classes are actually greater than the uncollected costs. And this happens because I think in some cases, businesses, their bills are due in 15 days, and a lot of them don't pay until, not because they want to not pay, but because their billing systems don't pay fast enough. A lot of times they incur a lot of late fees. I don't know if we'll see that as a small commercial issue. But generally with residential accounts, I think for the most part, the late fee revenue offsets the uncollected cost, but doesn't overcome it entirely, although it can in some cases. So the carrying charges could be something that the utility pays as an expense on holding that balance as a positive amount, and it could also be something that they charge to the account as if it's a negative amount. So that goes up and down. The way carrying charges are set, they are based on a short-term interest rate. That's something the commission determined probably about 10 years ago, and so that's always been that way. That's distinct from, those are expenses that get incurred and get sort of amortized over a period of time. Working capital is different. It's still money that the utility has to sort of put out there in order to make this work, manage the cash flows, but it is treated differently than amortized amounts that are carrying costs. Working capital gets paid the utility's rate of return, which is usually somewhere around 7% as the return amount. I'm not sure how the tax calculation works into that. After taxes, it's bigger. You have to get compensated for the tax amount. But working capital is simply that the utility is going to essentially have to pay the retail supplier. I think they pay them 5 days after the bill is due. So money goes from the utility to the retail supplier, in this case to the CCA if we use the same set of rules. And then the money will come back from the customer, assuming it's paid in full and avoiding any complications when it's not. It's going to come back probably fairly close to the due date, which is for residential customers 20 days after the bill is due, if I have that right. So there is a period of time, the 15 days, between when the utility has paid the retail supplier and the utility gets paid for that amount of money by the customer. The utility has 15 days worth of time when that money, they're just holding, they're just waiting to get paid. So they have to fund that cash flow, and they are permitted to earn a return on that fund that reflects the same kind of return they would get if they had to put a pole in the ground and have that sit there for some period of time. That's a big policy determination for working capital expenses that, it's a whole rate case thing, but this is how we're doing that for POR. So you'll see working capital as cash working capital as a component for the discount rate component. All right. Any questions on that? I know we're getting into the weeds on those details.
Bill, this is Stan. In that bullet, you said it's not used by PHI or PE, the cash working capital.
That is correct. Only BG&E is currently getting a working capital element for their POR rates. Where you might see a distinction here, where there might be a desire or a need to incorporate that, is because of the scale of what's happening in PEPCO will be much larger than what they have experienced thus far with retail choice switching. So when half of your, or 200,000 accounts, I think the way it works out is like the amount that you're holding is roughly equivalent to just being out a full month's bill all the time. It sort of varies, fluctuates up and down. I haven't examined that calculation in a number of years, but I think you're going to see a desire from any utility that has a lot of working capital necessary to provide this. It's sort of like what would have happened if retail choice was successful at a level where you had half the accounts switch to retail choice. That hasn't happened. Most retail choice switching is 20% plus or minus a little at the moment. So I think even though it's not done for retail choice in Pepco or PE, I think there may be a desire to do that based on the amount of working capital is going to increase for this beyond what they've seen in retail choice.
And is that something the commission would weigh in on?
Well, so to the extent that anyone is opposing the development of a discount rate, it's usually part of a tariff. I would imagine we would tariff this as part of, there's a supplier coordination tariff. I don't know if we need a whole separate CCA coordination tariff, or if that is simply something we begin to make edits into the supplier coordination tariff. But to the extent that there is disagreements about the composition of any of these discount rate components, how they're calculated, commission has to approve it if it's a tariff. So there's the opportunity to disagree and make your case would be done at the point where the discount rate is established for the CCA.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, Judge Grace, if we could roll down to the allocation of pre-existing SOS uncollected costs. So we've already talked about this a little bit, so I think we can get through this and maybe drill into some details if there's more. So the way standard offer service has an admin charge, I talked about that a little bit. They don't use a discount rate approach to it. It's just that the admin charge is calculated in a similar way, where you take annual costs and the expected amount of sales and any unpaid balances. I mean, anytime a utility incurs an expense, there's often a way to sort of make sure all of that expense gets recovered, or they have to get compensated for the risk of not being able to collect things. So pre-existing standard offer service, I think this is where I was trying to address a little bit of this when Lori McGilvray asked the question. So if there are costs for standard offer service, uncollected costs that should be recovered in the next, in the years after the CCA begins operating, but were incurred prior to that, well, we need to figure out what's the appropriate way, if there is one, to recover Montgomery County's portion of the pre-existing SOS uncollected cost. So that might be identifying it and just accounting for it and shifting it into a balance that you're going to collect with the POR discount rate. And that's assuming we're using a POR discount rate for the CCA. Or there may be some other way to do that, but it is an SOS cost. And so you can't really mix it in with distribution rates without perhaps running afoul of some legal precedent for keeping those things separate and distinct. But if there was no experience of what the Montgomery County uncollected costs would be, you might have to start with a discount rate of 0, or a discount rate that had 0 uncollected costs reflecting in it, and that might then create like a disconnect when you had your first year's worth and then have to begin collecting it. So I think, and maybe the Pepco folks can talk a little bit about their ability to identify individual accounts by their location in the counties. One of the issues that sort of came up is if I have a customer that is on SOS and October 1 of 24, they have a an unpaid balance. They're not, maybe they're just paying late and they're making a payment, so they're not being considered delinquent, or they're not being considered for disconnection, but they have like $50 that's past due that they just haven't caught up with yet. And then they are switched to the SO or to the CCA. That individual account is not yet in any way delinquent because they're sort of current, but they have a past due amount from like a month or two bill ahead of time. Maybe they had a high summer bill and just didn't pay the amount in full. But how the utilities handle partial payments is probably written into their tariffs and that sort of thing. But so an individual account may become a CCA customer and they have an uncollected amount associated with their SOS billing previously. Well, how's that going to get collected? Because they're no longer, SOS isn't being billed anymore for them. They're on the CCA. I think there's probably a way that we can model this based on what would happen if a customer did this with a retail choice bill. And then there is some issues that I'm not actually entirely sure how that would work, but switching to the CCA is sort of like switching to a retail supply. So if you become a default CCA provider or customer, then you're bringing with you a delinquent amount that has not yet triggered anything other than a late charge. That has to still get billed, and so we sort of have to work out like are there going to be any particular issues with that. But for the most part, we just need to identify what's the right way. The one we have to establish, and I don't know that anyone opposes this, that any pre-existing SOS uncollected costs that would normally have been collected through the admin charge is a portion of that be collected from the CCA and carried through when those customers transition en masse. And if so, what is the appropriate way to allocate the total SOS uncollected amounts? And we're talking about uncollected costs. Presumably there may be some administrative costs that need to be treated this way as well. So this is sort of I don't view this as a technical issue as the way to implement it, but we will need to decide how much and which types of costs are properly allocated to Montgomery County customers once they move to the CCA for collection through the CCA's administrative overhead approach instead of using SOS. So there are a number of ways to allocate costs, portions of revenue, number of accounts, if not revenue, then kilowatt hour sales, that sorts of thing. But we haven't proposed that just yet. I think that's probably something we'll need to understand, if we have some estimate of where those numbers look now, probably develop an understanding of how the SOS accounting stands at the moment, if there's any unpaid balances or if there's any expectations of what will happen between now and say like the next 18 months if there are increases in the SOS cost. All right, questions on that? We already talked about that a lot, so hopefully.
I think you're good, Phil.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so moving on to the top of the second page. So let me just take that the last square bullet from the previous circle bullet that's at the very top. I'm just gonna very hesitantly talk about payment posting because it can be a big deal when you're sort of trying to anticipate what happens when people switch things. So I think I mentioned a little bit that there might be a customer coming into the CCA with a past due amount that may include a past due amount that reflects the SOS generation. They're going to get billed by the utility, and they're going to have a current amount that comes from the CCA for that month, and they're going to have a past due amount that is SOS. And they don't pay the full bill that first month. There needs to be a function within the utility's billing that identifies, okay, a portion of the bill that's due. And I'll just use the example of a $100 bill that half of it is the previous month that was unpaid, or a portion of it, and then $50 of it. So 50 old and 50 new, and they don't pay the full amount. Let's say they only pay 75, so there's not enough to pay the full amount back. So the $25 that is unpaid, does that apply to the past due amount, or does that apply to the current amount? So conventionally, we apply the old. Any payments are first applied to the oldest of the payments due, and then any unpaid amounts you create a past due amount of the current amount, and that just rolls forward. That usually is seems pretty straightforward. It can create issues when there are, the SOS amount is unpaid, and then the utility bill is, it's not quite half and half between generation and distribution these days. But if it were, there's often a desire to pay all of the distribution bill before any of the supply, because the distribution triggers a disconnection if it's unpaid for some period of time, whereas the supply rate does not always, although an SOS supply rate or a purchase receivable supply rate would. So this is just something for the folks that are familiar with this. We need to take a close look at, is payment posting going to be a thing we have to worry about? Well, we certainly don't have to decide that here, but I'm sure the folks at the CCA, to the extent that you're going to want to know how this works, but it's probably a pretty lengthy discussion to kind of explain how it works and where the problems that we've dealt with. I think this might not be as big of a problem if the whole thing's under utility consolidated billing, but I'm bringing it up because I know it's generated considerable controversy and other types of choice-related discussion.
Phil, this is Robbie real fast. It might be easier to use the switch date as the starting point. Or what is SOS prior to the start date for the new supplier versus after the start date? That might be able to see a little bit, where SOS might fall. Was it the old SOS or the new after the switch date?
And when you say the switch date, you mean like the default switch date on October 1 of 24, or?
Correct. Or whatever the date is, correct, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't put a lot of time into thinking about this type of detail, but I think maybe the folks who are familiar with this should think about how this could work, and then we'll parse through it. I have not identified that this creates a technical issue yet. It just might be something that if we create a set of rules to deal with it, we have to know what's the right thing to do.
Because within our system today, under current TPS, we can see, as to that start date, what was SOS versus what under the utility versus SOS under the supplier. So we can identify what is what at any given point in time based on that switch date.
And when you have a customer that switches to retail choice from SOS and they have a delinquent SOS commodity amount, the SOS being the oldest generation gets paid first, right?
Correct.
And does that also work if they switch from retail choice to SOS, where the oldest generation gets paid first, even if it's not SOS?
Well, now keep in mind, it's POR, so there shouldn't be any. Well, I mean, in the system, we can see what is, what is utility arrears versus supplier arrears, and it's applied based on the current billing logic. Oldest utility arrears, supplier arrears, utility current, supplier current, and then any other charges.
Yeah.
So it would apply the same way.
We just need to. I didn't.
I guess. Yeah.
It kind of popped up as, oh, this might be something we need to figure out. I don't know how hard this is going to be, but I just mentioned this. So I'm still running with the assumption that nothing fancy has to happen. It's just a matter of probably whatever rules apply for retail choice for payment posting and delinquency issues apply to the CCA, and we just have to make sure everybody understands.
Well, put it this way: if you want to change that, that's going to be a cost.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know that. I think it probably works okay if we treat it just like a retail choice.
Exactly, because it is. It's a regular third-party supplier switch. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna move on unless there's any questions. All right. So the next circle bullet item here is so this is just a conceptual talk here. I think I've been already talking as if we're going to do this, but I didn't want to foreclose the discussion of it. POR rates, if retail choice and CCA are both using utility consolidated billing, I think we've been talking like we're going to develop a separate POR rate for the CCA. I mean, that's an assumption that might be appropriate, or that might be not appropriate. And I think folks just need to sort of think about like what that means, and whether or not that's a good idea. I think technically it's probably, it's an extra step the utility has to do that might incur some operational costs, hopefully not any sort of programming costs. Because right now, I think all POR, it gets the same rate in the same rate class. And now we would basically have a separate POR rate to be applied to the customers that are coming from the CCA. So hopefully not a technical problem. It might, quite possibly, there's no need to do it because the CCA and the retail choice customers basically act the same because they're working the same way. I guess the distinction might be there is the POR rate's going to apply for both Montgomery County and Prince George's County customers, and then the CCA is just Montgomery County. If there is a distinction there, Montgomery County has a different percentage of these expenses, then it might be right to do that. So, yeah, we don't have to. We eventually will need to think about this. I guess staff will probably come up with something that will say, here's what we think you should do as a suggestion, and folks can figure out. People should just kind of, each organization should identify like some of their position points on some of these bullets that we're dealing with. All right, the second bullet there at the top, the circle bullet is how often would we be revising the CCA rates? I think we typically do this annually, so that might be fairly reasonable for the CCA. All right, unless there's questions, we can kind of move down a little bit further. So the question on the first round bullet there, solid bullet, is what other differences of retail choice billing will develop if there's any. So I think when we were talking to Pepco, a couple of things popped up here, and hopefully nothing's a particular problem. The CCA will, and they're going to operate like a retail supplier, so they have to kind of go through the process of setting up supplier credentials. The second bullet, the exchange data, you actually test a little bit to make sure that's going to work. Each utility has their own kind of protocol for what they do to test you. I think that may take a week or two or a couple of weeks to get scheduled and then to be done, but it's we should have plenty of time once we know when the CCA is going to start. When switching occurs, there is a letter that goes out from the utility informing you when you've been switched and to whom. And it also, I think, informs you when you've been switched back, SOS. So the CCA enrollment will probably have something like that, whether or not it's the same letter, just CCA's name instead of a supplier or something else happens. And then we've already talked about supplier coordination tariff, and we might need to have a CCA version of it, or we just add the CCA into the supplier coordination tariff and hopefully not have to do a lot more to it. All right, and I see Lori's hand up, and I don't know if there's anybody else. Go ahead, Lori.
Thank you, Phil. Sorry to go backwards slightly. I put this in the chat, but I'm wondering if it's possible to answer the question whether the utilities can provide any data with regard to number of, or whatever the right metric is, of delinquent accounts in Montgomery County. Just this issue of should there be a separate POR for the CCA? That data might speak to whether Montgomery County customers are somehow significantly different from others in the territory, and whether or not that would drive the discount rate. So I'm just wondering whether the data is available that might be a piece of helping to answer this question of the separate POR for CCA.
And is that sort of like a question where, like, running a report that sort of identified the eligible CCA customers and trying to like take the average compared to the rest of the system to see, is that what you're looking at? Or
yeah, so if kind of the historical average is 1 to 2% delinquent accounts amongst a million customers in BG&E, are the 14,000 Montgomery County somehow more or less than that average. And so if you did it by utility, then you would be able to tell, should there be a distinct discount rate for Montgomery County CCA?
Okay. Well, let me see if the utility folks want to comment on, do you have the ability to sort of distinguish whether or not some of these expense elements that show up in the POR rate in particular are something you can identify differences between eligible CCA customers and then, you know, the rest of the rate base? Is that, Robbie, do you have some insight into that?
That I do not. I know that we should be able to, identify Montgomery County customers, but as far as, all the other, the cost, I'm not sure.
So
I
in
have
terms
to
of,
look into it and see.
is there a way to sort of run reports on the customer accounts that like either, identify, I don't know how you would identify who's in Montgomery County or not. I don't know if the county of residence is part of your data in each account, or if you can.
We have a jurisdiction code that we can use, I
Okay.
think. Yeah.
I mean, do utility systems work in such a way that if you use that code to sort of index, and then you sort of, just we're looking to average on, unpaid revenue over some period of time, or, as a snapshot or something, do your systems allow for that sort of?
I have no idea. I mean, I've never requested that, so I don't know. I have to get back to you on that.
Okay.
Hey, Phil, this is Leah. Can I just, I think this is an interesting question. I can't help but wonder, not to overcomplicate it, but, kind of thinking back too on the legislative mandate that came out last session with, I think it's Senate Bill 30, which basically restricts the low income customer population shopping options. I mean,
Right.
to me, that also seems to be related here and is going to tie in some way. I mean, I know we haven't talked about it yet, so there's a lot to figure out there, but I think there's probably a couple pieces to this. It's the delinquent customers, and then there's also what customers are even allowed to shop versus not. You know what I mean? Another layer.
Yeah. So like the distinction.
It seems to me that if there's a segment of customers that are going to have some shopping restrictions in the first place, they may be the same customer population that might have a tendency to have more delinquency. And so then if you take that out of the equation right off the top, then does it really impact the discount rate and the things you're trying to figure out? I think, does that question make sense, or am I not making sense?
I mean,
No, you are.
I think are you suggesting maybe that the shopping restrictions would also apply to the CCA? That they could not take CCA?
I don't see anything. I mean, I think somebody needs to look at that law and see. I don't think it has an exclusion for Montgomery County. So I think that there does need to be some legal, analysis on how do these two, what's the interplay between these two laws? They both passed during the same session. One restricts all low-income shoppers in Maryland. So they didn't carve out Montgomery County and say, give a special circumstance, and this was going on at the same time. I'm literally just raising it as something that we should be mindful of and potentially making a plan to deal with.
Leah, are you talking about House Bill 397?
I forget the number, but yeah, it's the low income one that passed, though. I forget the number, but yeah.
Yeah, it didn't restrict them. I thought it said that the suppliers' rates had to be approved by the PSC.
Right, but
to participate in the program.
To shop and to switch suppliers. So it may not apply to the county, but I'm just simply saying they did take action to say, hey, these customers can only be on certain kinds of products. And so if the CCA is going to be offering a product, presumably, I think one way of reading that is to say, all right, well, that product also has to satisfy that requirement, and the commission has to come up with, a process for figuring that out, and how are they going to approve them and all of that stuff. So it's a totally separate process. I'm just trying to say that I think if we're trying to drill into the question on impacts on discount rates and, you know, all of this, and really try to home in on the Montgomery County piece of this, I don't think you can just ignore that. I think we have to at least like look at it and say, does it matter? Do we have to worry about it, right? That's really all I'm saying, is just to, you know, put a little flag out there to say we probably need to remember to look at that.
Well, that's a fair point. I think we should probably make sure that we have a correct interpretation of how those two pieces of legislation interact. All right. Well, we'll try and I have a note there. I'll ask our attorneys to see if we can talk about, or figure out if we have a position on that. Leah, did your folks have a position on whether or not? I mean, are we sort of asking the question? Is the CCA considered to be shopping, such that there's restrictions on it, or is the CCA the default supply, and so it's not shopping?
I think that's the question. We don't have a position on it per se, Phil. To me, both these things happen simultaneously, and the legislature did seem to take a position on how low-income customers are treated. And so, to me, it's just somebody needs to answer it. That's literally all I was trying to flag.
Okay. Yeah, no, it doesn't sound like it might create a technical problem if it's something we have to deal with. Okay, I appreciate you bringing it up. Okay, let's just other questions that we can drop down. The next bullet here, we touched on this. I think Robbie, you brought this up earlier in the call. So commodity versus non-commodity products. All right, so just generally, this is an issue because the utility does not purchase something that is non-commodity under UCB. So we're going to use UCB. So presumably, if the CCA is selling something that is not a commodity, the utility would not purchase it in the exact same way that they would not purchase the billing receivables for a non-commodity sold by a retail supplier. And I will ask the utility folks to correct me if I get this wrong, but I think the billing is permitted. Like, you could bill for a TV on your electric bill. You could tell the when the retail supplier sends back the amount to put on the bill. I think I had a $60 example for kilowatt hours, and they could say, we'll actually collect $70 because it's $60 for the energy and $10 for the rent on their TV set. But the utility's like, well, that's great, but we are not going to send you the 70, we'll send you the 60. And if the utility gets paid the 10, somehow that makes its way back. I think maybe nobody actually does this, and so the mechanism hasn't been dealt with. But is one of the utility folks help me out with? I think the billing is permitted. It's just that you won't purchase anything other than the commodity. And I think distinguishing something as being a commodity in all practical terms means that if it's billed on a kilowatt hour basis, it gets purchased. So those are two things. Maybe one of the utility folks flesh that out a little bit. Is that correct? One, that the suppliers can bill something that's not energy. And typically it would be like an energy service, or I don't know that anyone's actually selling TVs or something, but or even trying to. And that for the most part, anytime that this has been flagged, it has not been anything that's been billed on a kilowatt hour basis. Is that correct? I'll ask
If
Rob.
yeah, so for BGE,
Go ahead, Sean.
go ahead. Yeah, so for BGE, we have about, I think, 4 or 5 non-commodity suppliers that are approved, and you're right. If it goes through that kind of system, then it's like for like a home contract, warranty contract, or something like that. It's a non-commodity. If it's coming in as a rate, then it's considered commodity, right? So it's 2 different transactions I would have to go through.
Okay. And Robbie?
Yeah, for PHI, we do not have that same setup. So it has to be for a supply rate only.
So if somebody tried to put through the $70 example, you would say we're only paying you the 60, and we won't actually bill the extra $10.
Well, it depends how they send it over, but our system would pay both because we cannot identify commodity versus non-commodity in our system.
Oh, okay. So you would pay it, but then at some point when you noticed it, you'd be like, hey,
We would
stop.
catch it. Correct. Exactly.
Okay. So they can't bill anything that's not
A commodity charge. Correct.
Okay. And the
For
BG
PHI.
system allows for a separate amount to be billed but not paid. That what Ashish just said?
I'm sorry, Phil, I was multitasking. What was the question?
So I was just trying to clarify. So the BG system will actually bill a non-commodity amount. So my example of billing a $60 commodity charge and then a $10 amount, when the supplier sends BG&E, hey, I need $70, you're gonna
Right, but they would have to be approved under the non-commodity supplier program, right? So there's only 4 or 5 currently. There are only 4 or 5 suppliers that are utilizing that functionality. So it's a different transaction, right, versus the normal commodity transactions that go through.
And it's also very limited in what we allow to be billed under there. It's not like it's anything and everything. It's
correct.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
So do they actually send 2 separate amounts? One is the commodity and one is the non-commodity under your system?
Yeah, it'll be two different transactions.
Okay, and so for them to be able to incorporate that in the billed amount, they have to set something up with you ahead of time.
Yes, that's correct.
Great. I'm not sure I was familiar with the detail on that. Do we have someone from Potomac Edison that can tell us how that works for PE? If not, we can follow up, or you're on mute and you're talking and not hear you yet. All right, well, we'll follow up with that. So I think we were looking at the legislation, and I don't know if the folks from Montgomery County sort of expressed some interest.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yes, we can.
So sorry, my mute was not working right. We do not allow non-commodity charges at all.
Okay, so anything that comes through that is on a kilowatt hour basis, you're just gonna, they're gonna bill that. You don't have a separate element like PG&E. Just explain they have, but are you just gonna bill whatever they send to what they tell you to put on the bill?
Right. Well, right. We do bill what they send. There's not a double check, but on a straightforward level, we don't allow it. We don't allow non-commodity. So we do bill what they send, but at face value, we don't allow non-commodity. If you're catching what I'm saying.
Right. If you noticed it, you'd be like, hey, stop doing that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. All right. Okay, so that's how that's set up at the moment, and I think again, running under the assumption that we're going to use the existing systems. Those are some of the limitations for any non-commodity services or products that the CCA wants to build or to incorporate in their products. So there is some language in I guess it's 7-510.3, paragraph J, that talks about energy services that are outside the commodity that the CCA can provide. If the CCA wants to do that, it looks like we will need to examine that, how that will work under the existing UCB billing, and make sure that now, quite possibly, that sort of billing, the utility will maybe take a different position on if it's something that is allowed for through the CCA legislation. It looks like all of the systems have some ability to bill something. It's just that the payment of it is sort of governed by each utility's tariff or policy on that. So, Stan or anyone from Montgomery County do you have any thoughts on that at the moment, or is there any knowledge that that's something that we will sort of have to prepare to be able to do?
Boy, I don't anticipate we're going to be billing things that aren't related to what the law allows. Maybe this is a section you were pointing out, Phil, that
Yeah.
the only thing we can bill is the cost of the electricity and promoting the use of renewable energy and providing and promoting energy efficiency programs that are offered by the utility, and we have to work in conjunction with the utilities. So programs that are offered by the utilities or that are in addition to what the utilities offer. That was a point, I remember a point of lots of discussion in the final passage of that bill, so. Yeah,
Okay, so I mean, to the extent that there are additional expenses or something that gets rolled into the commodity, that's or rolled into the rate you're charging.
Right.
Along those lines, doesn't appear that kind of falls even outside of what the utilities are doing right now. But to the extent that there was like an additional service that was not part of the commodity, that's not something that we have to worry about at the moment, at least.
Right. I don't think we're permitted to do it under the legislation. So.
Okay. All right. Well, that's even better. Okay. Unless there's any other questions, I will move on to kind of our last 2 points here, and then hopefully we can wrap it up. Okay. So from what we are able to tell from our discussions with Pepco, in spite of the fact that, once this is up and running, the full scale of it will be billing volumes for, far surpass what we're dealing with retail choice at the moment at 200,000. And I think what we glean from that is that the volumes are not an issue for the billing system. And we'll talk about costs in the next bullet. Let me just ask the folks at BG and PE. Now you have a lot smaller volume to deal with. So I think we were hoping that your folks, to the extent you've taken a look at this already, are not also seeing or coming up with the same idea that the existing billing system will be able to handle the expected CCA billing in addition to your retail choice.
Yeah, similar to Robbie, right? Pepco, we can transact 5,000 a day, so we shouldn't have any issues.
Okay, and so BG&E's expect to have, and we're talking about the billing. We still have to address the enrollment volume and how long it will take to transition customers. But just on an ongoing basis, I just want to make sure that, in particular for Pepco, that when half the system is being billed using the retail choice system, we were good there. BG&E will probably have 13,000 accounts, and PE's billing like 35,000. So it's as if you're having that many more people switch to retail supply. I think we're running under the assumption that both of PE and BG&E systems were fully capable of handling that many more retail supply accounts, and so we were pretty good there. I think that's just checking to make sure, but that's key to our element of not having to worry about anything else.
Yeah, for Pepco, at our peak, we had about 192,000 on choice at one time for Pepco, so
okay,
it should not be an issue for us.
Where does it stand now? It's like 100,000 or something?
Yes, it's much lower, yeah.
So once this is running, you'll be up somewhere above 300,000.
Correct.
All right. Okay, so the last bullet was, I think we were trying to address that there are ongoing costs for choice. And the EDI transactions have a cost that is based on the sort of the volume of transactions that go through the various providers. Those costs are relatively small per transaction, but they will scale with the volume. And then retail suppliers, in addition to the discount rate on the billed amounts, there are monthly fees that are paid to cover some other administrative or other sorts of operational costs. And to the extent that the CCA, I think the last bullet reflects costs that when you sort of apply to the utility to become a retail supplier, you have to do some testing. There might be some costs. So the accounts there, I think we're talking about is setting up that so that you can transact with the utility. At this point, these are going to be larger than what currently exists because the volume will be bigger, at least for Pepco. But they are not expected to be sort of unmanageable costs. So, and to the extent the utility folks have taken a look at this and are, maybe want to provide any thoughts about whether or not they expect the CCA beyond any system or programming costs. Essentially, the CCA will experience about the same costs that retail suppliers are paying per account per month, which is probably on the order of. I think, Robbie, I think we talked to your folks about what the monthly charges per account are. Can you go over that again?
For the supplier billing for the bill ready fees?
Yep.
Yeah, it's 62 cents for residential, 75 cents for commercial per bill.
And they pay that, you just like invoice them every month for the number of bills?
Correct. Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then do you have costs for when a retail supplier comes into Maryland and gets a license and they set up with you to do EDI? Do they pay a charge to set up their account and to do the testing?
Not for the testing part, but we do have a registration fee that we associate to new suppliers when they come on board.
Okay. Can you share how much that is, or?
I was trying to think what it is. I don't know right offhand.
Okay, but it's relatively probably
It's
not.
like 150 or 100 or something like that. But don't quote me on that.
Okay, but yeah, so it's relatively small.
It's small, correct.
Okay.
But I did want to go back to the for the enrollments.
Yeah.
We did reach out to our current EDI provider, and we can up that to 10,000 per day. But we need it in 2 different batches. So one batch of 5,000, one batch of 5,000. So 10,000 per day we can accommodate for enrollment switches. So that should speed up the transition.
So that, I know I really didn't want to talk about enrolling yet because I know it's a very interesting topic. Everybody
Well,
wants
yeah,
to
talked about the volume.
Right. No,
Okay.
So given that you're probably that if you were switching on meter read dates, and you have 21 of those per month, you might get very close to the full 200,000 accounts in 1 month at 10,000 a day. So
Correct. Yeah.
That might be pretty
You can do
good.
it that way.
All right.
Hey, Phil, you have a couple of questions.
Uh,
Misty Renninger and then Lisa Brennan.
Okay. What was the first one?
I was just wondering if the question regarding the retail supplier monthly fees for billing, were you looking at things like if the CCA were going to regularly be asking us questions the way the suppliers do now? We bill for things like that. Is that what you're referring to with that question?
Yeah, so I guess I was trying to capture that, and I wasn't as familiar with the monthly per account charges other than what we had talked about with Pepco. But to the extent that there are fees that you recover, specific services from retail suppliers. I didn't try to make an assumption. I just say, if there's like per account monthly billing charges, or if you have separate like data charges or whatever, would those be applicable to the CCA? So it would be both of those. It would be the monthly per account billing.
You just meant all inclusive. Okay. I just was trying to gather where you're coming from with that. I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was trying to, as we were talking about this, make sure that folks understood that. I'm guessing most of these are in the supplier coordination tariff that I think we sent that around so folks can see what the scale of those look like. All right. So how about for BG&E? Do we have, is the BG&E sort of monthly billing charges similar to what Petco talked about at a couple of, less than $1 a month?
I think it's like 50 cents a month for billing services.
Okay, sounds good. All
And
right.
I don't think we charge anything. I don't think we charge anything for testing or onboarding a supplier.
Okay. Yeah, I think most of the, like, if folks want to know what those are, most of that stuff should be in supply coordination tariffs, because I think the commission has to approve those. If not, you know, we can, as we get closer to it, we're probably going to want them. Okay, Judge Grace, I think you mentioned there was another person with a question. Did we get everybody?
Yes, Lisa Brennan.
Oh, okay, Lisa.
Hey, I just wanted to circle back real quick on the previous bullet about energy services.
Yeah.
Beyond commodity being on the bill.
Yep.
I think Stan was reading, if I recall correctly, and you can, you know, correct me, but Stan was reading from the portion of the statute that basically talks about what's offered by the utilities and filed by them under, I guess it's the Empower statute. But it does have a provision in there that we just may want to circle back to. I'm not suggesting that we delve into this further today, but it does say that the CCA can provide and promote energy efficiency programs that are supplemental to any programs that are already promoted under paragraph 2. So that is something that we may need to circle back to depending on what we decide to do.
Okay.
See if that's a billing issue for, it sounds like 2 out of the 3, it may be an issue.
Yeah, so I mean, to the extent that it's, we just sort of go back over, I think the PEPCO and PE, they will, if you send them an amount to put on the bill, their system is not going to sort of do anything other than apply that to the bill. They don't want you to put anything on there that's not a commodity. To the extent that this is required by the legislation, maybe that's something we need to re-examine.
That's all, yeah.
Yeah, BG's got a system that allows for a distinct charge, but you have to sort of get cleared to do it. And so that system may be able to handle something separate, you know, already. That might, you know, so it sounds like maybe some operational changes. Hopefully, again, it's not a system programming issue. So I guess if, you know, to the extent that the county wants to start thinking about that, then, you know, the earlier you can begin to sort of talk about what it is that might go on that is not strictly, you know, recovering the cost of providing the energy, but also providing another type of related service permitted by the law. You know, we should probably start talking about what that would look like and make sure we can do it the way you expect.
Understood.
All right. So Judge Grace, that was kind of the entirety of what we thought we were going to try to cover today in terms of the outline. Again, the takeaways are, you know, using the existing retail choice system seems to be a good way to allow the CCA to do what they need to do. And it has minimal changes that are expected other than, you know, scaling some of the operational expense. There's a number of policy type of decisions that have to be discussed and made over some period of time. Folks should maybe take a look at this outline and think about what their positions might be on some of the things like discount rate and allocating the SOS costs that exist ahead of time. But probably what we would want to do is, we have to. I hope hopefully enrollment will get knocked out in the 2 or 3 meetings that we have scheduled for it. But we'll need to eventually put together a schedule for when we would decide some of these policy issues. But we may have a little bit more time. Probably now important to make sure everybody understands what we're asking them to decide. So this stuff is pretty in the weeds. That's all we had. Maybe one thing I would like to add is so for our next meeting, which I think you said was going to be on February 1st, we will dive into the issues about enrollment and how the enrollment of the of customers will work both as the initial transition on the like the switching day of October or thereabouts in 2024, and then ongoing enrollments and how that will work. We will probably want to reach out to the utilities again to ask them some questions about what their concerns are about technically how this will be accomplished, especially with the volume that PEPCO needs to deal with. Very happy to hear that your capability may have expanded a little bit beyond where it was originally stated, so that might solve a number of our problems. So, the Judge, we will put together an outline like this one, but for enrollment, and we will get that out of the week before the meeting on the 1st, and earlier if possible.
Thank you very much, Phil and David and staff. Is there anything else that needs to be taken up from any of the other members of the working group?
This is Lisa Brennan again. Can I just, so we're switching the next meeting from January 25th to February 1st. Does that mean that all the subsequent ones are every 2 weeks from that? Or are we, I'm just trying to figure out like what my
Yes,
calendar says basically.
They're, with the turning of the year, there's another working group that meets every Tuesday at 1 o'clock, and our meetings had aligned. So starting now, our next meeting will be on February 1st and go every other week from there.
Okay, so are you going to update are you going to send out a new Outlook invite? Because I think we went through the end of the year.
Yes, I'm going to update the dates on that, and it should send out another invite, but I made the announcement at the beginning of this meeting, and we're talking about it again now.
Thank you.
Judge Grace, I think we don't have meeting agendas yet for after we deal with enrollment. I think that probably puts us out to meetings in March. So to the extent that I think we have some ideas about what we should talk about next, but I perhaps might encourage if there's a sort of a wide variety of things we could dive into next. I think we have sort of captured our technical problems we have to deal with the SOS and the billing and the enrollment. If there are folks that have a preference for things, or if there's some advice people have on what we should handle next, I certainly would be very happy to hear what those are as staff. I guess you would want us to kind of prepare meeting agendas for the post-enrollment stuff we're going to do in like March and April.
Yeah, the enrollment is definitely going to take a few meetings, so we have a little bit of time, but yeah, if anyone has suggestions as to what issues we need to take up next, that would be great.
Hi, Judge, this is, sorry, I'm sorry. This is Leah Gibbons, Judge. I think, as I stated at the beginning of the call, it sounds like the county's maybe interested in this, and we would definitely be interested in having a meeting where we're talking about, CCA models, that are existing around the country, and sort of the role that retail suppliers play and CCAs play in both those models. I don't know if that needs to wait till March and be like an official agenda meeting, or if the preference would be to do that sort of as a one-off meeting, similar to how we did the SOS briefing, several weeks ago. But just throwing that out there as a topic that we're certainly interested in having a discussion about.
Okay, that sounds good. And I will work on how to fit that in.
Great, thank you.
I also see Ms. McGilvray's hand is raised.
Thank you, Judge Grace. I'm just curious, since we're not meeting for 3 weeks, whether it might be possible to get any answers to some of the questions that have come up today that couldn't be answered. Like, are the utilities able to provide any data on delinquent accounts amongst those that are Montgomery County accounts? And then some of the questions about how it works now for retail supply, where a customer switches from SOS to retail, and how any uncollected amounts are moved when those switches happen. So it would be very valuable if it's possible to get answers to any of those questions, or at least know when it may be provided prior to our next meeting.
Utilities? Anybody have a response?
Laurie, could you maybe shoot those questions around in an email to the group, just so we have them?
Yes, absolutely.
And as to when to respond, I think I'd have to circle up with our folks and get back to you on that.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm more than
this
happy to
spot
put it
briefing
in.
for this spot briefing for Potomac Edison. We're the same. I sent some notes out to some folks while the call was going on, but if you send out what you're looking for, we can see if we can track it down or not and let the group know definitively.
So, Ms. McGilvray, can you send an email out to the group?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you,
Okay,
Judge
great.
Grace. I'll send these questions out to the group, and I appreciate their willingness to respond.
Okay, great. Anyone else? Okay, thank you again, staff. That was a great presentation today. And
Coach,
go ahead.
sorry, I had a question that I put in the chat. I didn't know if it was visible. I was just curious if we were planning to propose after the February 1st, there's an EDI working group meeting, February 2nd. I wasn't sure if we were planning to have the information ready for the enrollment for that meeting, if that was the plan or not.
You see, I'm gonna try to answer that. I don't know that we would have anything to the, like a change control is the, you know, that you're talking about putting a change control document to send to the EDI working group or propose some stuff.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were aiming to have something ready or if that was the goal.
I think no, at this point, I think we're just trying to, I mean, to the extent that folks are able to sort of inform that group that this is happening and if we have a feel for what the changes look like. But I kind of think that it's going to be after March. So after we go through our, we'll have to make some decisions about how enrollments are going to work. And that might involve a need to make, you know, some changes to the EDI transactions to do that. But I think we're going to need to go through, so we won't know for I mean, they usually meet like the second Wednesday or something. It probably won't even be till like April till we actually have something locked down that we could actually write a change control.
Yeah, Phil, this is Robbie. I did bring that up to the Maryland group this past Wednesday. So they are aware of the CCA, and Brandon will have this added to the agenda going forward.
Okay.
That's what I was looking for, was if there's something we can bring as an update or something that really you wanted us to bring to the working group.
You know, so as long as they are aware of it, but I think they're probably interested in knowing, like, once this group has decided kind of the business processes and the policies, and to the extent that those are decided and locked down, then they'll probably want to know how to change the transactions to make that happen. But I think I'm glad, Robbie, it's good that you brought that up to them. And to the extent that we need to provide some feedback, or if they have questions that they want to kind of make sure that we are considering, that would be great. But I think we'll just need to go updates each month as you know, and as we know more, maybe we'll be able to give them some more. But I'm guessing that change controls are still a couple months out before we'd be able to give them something. But no, I'm glad folks are thinking. That's great that we're sort of coordinating that already. That group doesn't like to get surprised, I'm sure.
No, they don't.
Definitely not.
So, all right.
Okay, everybody, it sounds good. Thank you very much for your participation today, and we will see everybody on February 1st at 1.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.